I am honored to introduce Chris Coons, who is one of our heroes, one of my heroes in the Senate and in Congress. He has worked to find bipartisan solutions on issues confronting Delaware and the nation for years. He is a member of the Foreign Relations, the Judiciary, the Appropriations, Ethics, Small Business, and he is a person of deep faith. Very important for us here is Chris Coons is a Presbyterian elder. And I'd love him to answer the question, if he would, which is more important to him, being a senator or a Presbyterian elder? No, you don't have to answer that. That's okay. But he was ordained by the West Presbyterian Church in Wilmington, Delaware, where my good friend who just passed away was the pastor there, and Chris was here to preach at and to speak at Jeff Crabill's service, in which he was honored, and we were honored to have him here. He has a master's degree in ethics from Yale Divinity School and a law degree from Yale Divinity School. He has worked with the South African Council of Churches, where he had the opportunity to preach at Archbishop Desmond Tutu's church, and he continues to preach regularly in the houses of worship across Delaware. And we would love someday to have Chris Coons come and preach here at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, if he would just stick around over the weekend sometime. Longtime resident of Newcastle County, Chris grew up in Pike Creek and now lives in Wilmington with his wife Annie. There are 3 children, Michael, Jack, and Maggie. Senator Chris Coons.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the blessing of that gracious introduction and a chance to be back with you here at historic New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. For those of you who don't know us Presbyterians, it was wonderful hearing your introduction and the description of the activities and services here, because they exactly match what my home church, now First and Central in Wilmington, is doing. We literally have an after-school youth mentoring and tutoring program that happens on the floor above our main sanctuary, and a homeless shelter in the winter that happens in the floor below. And for those of you who don't know us, one of the great joys of being a Presbyterian is I am intensely uncomfortable right now. Knowing laugh from about 2/3. One of the things that underpinned the fascination Jeff Flake and I have for each other is that, well, he's Mormon. And we Presbyterians just don't do a whole lot of talking about our faith. We do a whole lot of doing. We build churches and hospitals and schools and get busy helping people with housing and tutoring and right? But we don't really talk about why we're doing it. We just do it and then hope somehow someday you might figure it out. And so the idea of someone who for 2 years in Zimbabwe, in a language not native to his own home state, walked up to, I guess, doors or huts and rang a doorbell or knocked and said, "Hi, would you like to talk about Jesus?" I just found fascinating. And to him, the idea that I would spend years as an active Presbyterian and not ever talk to people about Jesus struck him as truly puzzling. So in some ways, the root of our brief moment of bipartisanship, which we are sustaining even today in our work together on the floor, was the common thread of our call to work and to share and to try and find ways to demonstrate the centrality of our faith across what are enormous differences in our traditions, in our teachings, in our family experiences, in our witness, and in our political values. What better place to think and talk about partisan division and how it's affecting our country than in a place that is the successor in interest to the Presbyterian Church, where a deeply troubled president came to seek solace in the midst of our most divisive, most bloody, most difficult civil war. When I first got to the Senate, it was 2010, and the Tea Party had taken over a lot of the House, and some would say was responsible for my election, in fact, to the Senate. And I went to meet with then the Senate President pro tem, Pat Leahy of Vermont. And I said to him, things seem pretty different from Joe Biden's time. Nobody has lunch together in the senator's only dining room anymore. It's literally empty. Nobody seems to be spending time together, getting to know each other. No one is raising their families together here. How does it seem to you? He said, oh yeah, pretty tough, pretty divided. I said, Mr. Chairman, has it ever been this bad? He goes, oh yeah, absolutely. I said, has it been this bad while you've been here? He said, oh no. I said, well, when has the division been this bad? He goes, Civil War. A man of few words. I'll remind you, it was President Lincoln who said famously, I've been driven many times upon my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for the day. That pew right there is the place from which he knelt and where he may have reflected on the unbelievable carnage unfolding across our country as an entire generation killed each other. My own ancestor was a commander in the New York 60th and was rewarded for his bravery with a bullet to the neck and the head as he led a charge up Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga. And one of the things I've reflected on overseas with my friend Bob Corker of Chattanooga, Tennessee, is that today it's possible for a senator from Tennessee and from Delaware, whose ancestors fought on opposite sides, to be not just acquaintances but genuine friends, not just friends but legislative companions, not just legislative companions but to deeply respect each other. But healing these wounds has taken generations. So I thought it'd be a good thing for us to take a few minutes and think about where we're headed and why and what we might do about it. Well, in the spirit of Lincoln, let me say that Donald Trump has been wonderful for my prayer life. When I go to divinity school reunions or meet with people I studied with or under, I say that my service in the Senate really strikes me as an extended field practicum in ethics and a wonderful opportunity for personal growth. All joking aside, I can't think of a more fundamental call, something that defines Christian faith more simply and clearly than this. Matthew 5:44. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. At the core of the Christian gospel is a whole series of messages and injunctions that are, by the logic of the world, crazy. Or let's at least say, uncomfortable. Because to literally try to begin my day in prayer earnestly for Donald J. Trump, for his success, for his health, for his wisdom, is not something I was used to doing before this last year and a half. And until I was in this office, I wasn't used to having complete strangers walking up to me and saying, I pray for you. Now, sometimes it's said with an edge. I'm praying for you. And sometimes it's said just simply, I'm praying for you. But it didn't mean as much to me until I was in this role in this place, where I feel utterly inadequate to the task at hand, to the challenges of the day, and to the division that I see unfold in front of me on the floor of the Senate every time we reconvene. I can only imagine how Lincoln in that pew felt, President of the United States, at exactly the time it was tearing itself apart. Elected exactly because of his positions on the most divisive issue of the day, the abolition of slavery. And yet, trying with every ounce of strength and skill, whether rhetorical, oratorical, or personal, to prevent the dissolution of the union he loved. If we think about what reconciliation would mean, what reaching across the aisle would mean in today's Senate, more than anything, the phrase that comes to mind for me is that it's uncomfortable, that it's difficult, that it asks us to get out of our comfort zone, that it challenges those of us who serve in the Congress to get up and move and to see and to be with people who are not our natural allies or enemies, but who in fact are, by partisan designation, our natural enemies. What makes this easier? Thinking about what our whole country is called to do. Yes, we're here to reflect in part on the midterm elections. They just happened. But something else just happened, didn't it? I don't know. Did you have a good Thanksgiving? Think about Thanksgiving for a moment. I don't know about your table, but as the first known Democrat in the history of my family, Thanksgiving has always been an opportunity for personal growth. At least going back to college days when I came home and inspired my grandmother to disown me by confessing I had just become a Democrat. A word she could hardly get out. God bless her. She cared so deeply about liberty, about our country, about our first principles, the idea that somehow this treasured grandson of hers could have made the fundamental and lasting moral flaw of changing party allegiance. From a family that in my Illinois branch of ancestry helped Lincoln found the Republican Party, was an unspeakable breach of lineage, protocol, and simple common sense. And we waspy Presbyterian types don't like anything that violates decency, order, and good common sense. But Thanksgiving has always been a chance for me to have an opportunity to sit next to hear from that difficult brother-in-law, that particularly engaged uncle, that really opinionated grandparent. And in between passing the turkey and trying to make small talk about things I don't pay enough attention to, like, I don't know, football, it's a chance to reflect on why are we really here sitting next to each other? Why do we keep coming back to this table year after year after year? And why is it always so hard? It's partly because of the tension between the image, that Norman Rockwell image of the perfect, happy, united family presenting the picture-perfect bird, which I don't know if you've cooked a turkey recently, but mine have never looked like that. And I don't know about your family, but we've never stood still that long or looked exactly that composed. I've been struck at the tension between the image, that Norman Rockwell image of the perfect family Thanksgiving, and its reality in all of our experienced lives. There may be a few of you here who actually had that perfect Thanksgiving this year, but my gut hunch is if we had a come to Jesus moment about it, we'd recognize that in every family in America, if not just the folks you hope show up come, but everybody who gets let in if they do show up, we've got some degree of every possible challenge and dysfunction that affects the American family. We've got messiness. We've got difficult and incomplete conversations. And we've got very strongly held and very divisive opinions. To me, it's similar to the difference between the idealized image of Christ I was raised with, that perfect blonde-haired, blue-eyed Englishman who was in the frontispiece of my childhood Bible, and who Jesus almost certainly was, a profoundly different Hebrew carpenter of millennia ago, and who lived a rough, challenged, difficult life in the midst of a very difficult time, and comes to us with a message not pure, not pristine, not easy, but difficult, uncomfortable, demanding, liberating. Think about how Thanksgiving has affected us as a country. Because if Lincoln's message to us was that the pathway towards the resolution of our differences, the only hope, is prayer, Thanksgiving began as a national day of prayer. It is somewhat of an idealized story about Indians and pilgrims making nice and helping feed each other, which is belied by the historical record, but it makes for a lovely Peanuts special. But if you think about the record of Thanksgiving, it was first declared by I think it was literally President George Washington in 1789, as a national day of thanksgiving and prayer, a recognition of having come through difficult times, division, and conflict. What else happens on Thanksgiving? Not just these attempts at the perfect family gathering, but stunning works of goodness, of kindness, of charity. On Monday, a friend of mine in Delaware did the latest iteration of a Thanksgiving turkey drive that started 30 years ago with 24 turkeys handed out by a small group of volunteers. On Monday, 6,000 Thanksgiving dinners were distributed up and down the state of Delaware by hundreds and hundreds of volunteers from dozens of different organizations, from different faiths and backgrounds, different schools and organizations. And this concentrated, intense effort of outreach is a reminder that at the core of the American spirit is not division, is not conflict, but is a willingness inspired perhaps by the Presbyterian example to roll up our sleeves and get to work recognizing and feeding and trying to help heal those around us for whom Thanksgiving is just one more day of need. At the end of the day, the most important message about Thanksgiving reflects, I think, one of the most core messages of the gospel, which is a radical redefinition of neighbor. A recognition of neighbor is not just those who look like us, who speak like us, who worship as we do, who might naturally fit around our Thanksgiving table if it is just our family, but a throwing open of the doors, a challenge, a demand to see as neighbor the other. It is exactly that ability to challenge us, to push us, in it, even at times uncomfortable ways, to see as neighbor those most distant, most different, most difficult, that is the path towards bridging our divides. It is that profoundly Christian understanding that's at the core of Matthew chapter 25. When, Lord, did I see you hungry or naked or in prison and fail to visit you or care for you? Oh, no, it wasn't me. It was the least of these, my brothers. When you cared for them, you cared for me. It is exactly the message at the core of the Good Samaritan parable, the message at the core of Matthew 25, that inspires so much positive, good work. And it's exactly because it is possible to see in our neighbor not the annoying, not the difficult, not the threatening, but Christ. That prayer and faith offers one path towards bridging divides that at times seem so deep as to be unbridgeable. What's the path in the Senate towards accomplishing this? It's not an easy one. We have a simple structure. It's called the weekly prayer breakfast. You may be familiar with it, but I'll give you a quick guided tour. There's this guy named James Langford from Oklahoma. He's a Republican and really conservative. And he's the Republican chair of the weekly prayer breakfast. And there's this guy named Coons from Delaware. He's a Democrat. And he's the current Democratic chair of the weekly prayer breakfast. We're the only two members with a divinity degree, which is one of those great moments when you think God's just winking at you. James and I would not naturally ever have met or become friends or gotten to know each other's spouses or prayed together, but for this moment of grace. And if I could simply summarize what makes the weekly prayer breakfast special, it's a few things. There's nobody there except the chaplain and senators, period. No lobbyists, no staff, no media. Sounds like a closed-door, smoke-filled room to me. We do a few simple things. Passage from Scripture, sing a hymn, often badly. Pray about our daily concerns, about members of our family or friends or staff who have succumbed to a disease or newly diagnosed, things that are beyond our ability to resolve. And then one member stands up and just shares, talks about the role of faith in their life, says exactly the things you wouldn't want an opposition researcher to ever know. And about 1 out of 3 times when a member stands and speaks, they cry. Different groups, different members come week in and week out, but we have folks who are Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Jewish, who are Mormon, who are Baptist, who are evangelical, unaffiliated, who are Catholic, who are Presbyterian even. And we do two things that I never see us do otherwise. We listen to each other, and we trust each other. And I think therein lies the very simple path towards bridging our partisan divides. Let me talk for a moment about the ways in which this is both natural and unnatural. Think about my job. My job is to be ceaselessly self-promoting, to be unrelentingly combative, to fight on behalf of my state, my parochial interests, my partisan interests, and to never stop fighting, to not yield 1 inch. I'm a gladiator. I'm a hired partisan, at least in the modern conception of the role of politician. And at times, the things I see my colleagues do to each other and say about each other on the floor would make the disciples weep. Actually, I'm not sure they would make the disciples weep. Because if you think about it, what's the story that happens literally right before, it's right after the Last Supper? Jesus has just revealed that he's going to be betrayed. And what do the disciples promptly begin to do? Fight over who's the greatest among them? Could you not stay awake? Could you not be, right? I mean, there are several moments in different Gospels where the disciples literally squabble amongst each other about who's the greatest, who's in charge, who's going to be at the right hand, who's going to be. And Jesus keeps looking at them and going, you really don't get it, do you? We're headed in a very different direction than you think we are. I'm not going to be handing out dukeships and, right? You're not getting to be the chair of this committee and the head of that conference. We're headed to Calvary, folks. So at the end of the day, the message, and this is from Luke 22, is not that which would make the disciples weep, but that which makes Jesus weep, which is our own lack of vision about who we really are and where we really are and what we're really called to do by his acts of grace that have healed us and forgiven us. You know, I did something last night that I doubt there's a lot of senators who've said this sentence recently. I stayed up late and reread Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards. One of the great classics of Calvinism. I got to tell you, if you're looking for a Reformed tradition refresher, it's all right there, baby. The doctrine of fundamental depravity. Jonathan Edwards, delivering a sermon in Northampton, Massachusetts, just wanted to make sure everybody in the room was clear about where we all stand in the eyes of God. We are, as he described, in one of many flights of fancy, like a spider hanging over a flame by a very gossamer, thin strand, the very maw of hell, yearning for your despicable, rotten soul. The devil himself, his flames leaping up and licking at your feet, and the only thing that holds you up is this tiny thread of grace, which though thin is strong as steel, which though seemingly elusive or invisible is actually the most powerful bond there is. He goes on at great length many times. Count yourselves blessed. We don't have to sit through a congregational sermon from the 18th century. But the fundamental point is right and remains the same. Those of us who serve in vaunted positions in society, whether the Pharisees of old or the senators of today, are no better, are no different than those who are homeless, who are prisoners and convicts, who are drug addicts. And Jesus, in his message and in his gospel and in his service, over and over and over, made it blindingly clear that the God that overlooks our profound depravity and sinfulness sees no difference between us. And it is only that incredible act of grace that has saved all of us. And if we could see each other with the eyes with which Jesus sees each of us, we would forgive each other all sorts of things. We just had this hearing. It was about a guy named Kavanaugh. You may have heard of it. I have a good friend in the Senate. His name is Lindsey Graham. Senator Graham and I have traveled overseas. We've worked on things that are really important to me about our engagement with the world. He saved the Food for Peace program when our president tried to eliminate it. And I really liked that guy. But he also kind of unloaded on me during a hearing in a way that was sort of memorable and a little unpleasant. And when I got home, someone I'm very close to said, "I hope you never speak to that man again." And a few days later, he called me, and I didn't return the call. 2 days later, he called me, and I didn't return the call. And then that enriched daily prayer life thing kicked in. And I thought to myself, how can I possibly go around the world and ask other countries to get past their differences and to move past their elections and to heal? And how can I possibly have the arrogance to ever preach anywhere? How can I possibly have just the unbridled arrogance to talk about chairing the Senate prayer breakfast and refuse to call back my friend Lindsey Graham because on one day, at one time, in one place, he hurt my feelings and offended me? If you look at each of us from God's eyes and count how much he has forgiven of us, we can at times find our way towards forgiving each other. How many of you know that Presbyterians take not wine but grape juice in our communion service? Those of us who are Presbyterian, right? There's a point here, and I'll make it briefly, and then we need to move on. If you go back and read in Paul's epistles, there's a history of what were incredible, brutal, political fights of his time. I think it's in Hebrews that he talks about whether or not meat sacrificed to idols should be consumed by Christians. This was a big deal at his time. Has anyone preached a sermon from this pulpit in recent years about the sinful nature of consuming meat sacrificed to idols? Probably not. My denomination was deeply riven over prohibition, the hot defining political issue of the 1920s. If you were going to meet with me at that time, you'd want to know whether I was dry or wet, and that was a big deal. And I think, some of you can correct me, the more learned among our clergy, I think that's why my denomination to this day drinks grape juice, not wine, when we take communion. But these are artifacts of fights long past. Today, in the Senate of the United States, today, in the body politic of the United States, we beat each other senseless over weaponized, selective quotes from Scripture that take a few things and make them defining and allow you to know whether I'm Republican or Democrat, whether I'm pro-gun or anti-gun, whether I'm pro-choice or pro-life, there's just a handful of issues that let you know whether I'm good or bad. And I'll tell you, one of the things that concerns me most about how we as people of faith approach each other is that we allow those things to divide us from each other with a depth and a persistence and a painfulness that would make Jesus weep. At the end of the day, we are called to treat each other as brothers and sisters, to forgive each other, to forbear with each other in ways that are uncomfortable, unusual, and lead to real growth. It's with that spirit that I try to approach my colleagues in the Senate. It's with that spirit that I hope you will forgive me, and it is with that spirit that I try, whenever and wherever possible, to preach the power of grace. Let me close with one quick quote that I find important as I begin my days and my journeys in this extended practicum in ethics. It's in Colossians chapter 3, 12 to 15. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with one another and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you were called to peace. And be thankful. In this Thanksgiving season, let me just close by thanking you for the challenge of this moment and opportunity, for this challenge of reflecting on how it is we can get through these days together, and for the challenge of trying to hear anew a message that, though ancient, is present, and that, though simple, is uncomfortable and difficult. And let me say, thank you, God bless you, and amen.